The chandeliers sparkled overhead like constellations forged from money and power, casting golden reflections onto polished wine glasses and polished egos. Inside this five-star Manhattan restaurant, laughter flowed like expensive champagne, until it didn't. A loud thud cracked through the air as Ethan Grant, billionaire tech mogul in a black tailored suit, slammed his fist against the table. The red wine trembled in its glass. "This is unacceptable," he bellowed at the young waitress standing before him, her face calm, her hands folded in front of her crisp white apron. The room stilled. Forks stopped midair. Diners leaned in, some shocked, others shamelessly entertained. A few raised their phones, already recording. The girl didn't flinch. She looked him straight in the eyes, and with a voice soft enough to be missed, but sharp enough to slice through silence, she said one sentence. And just like that, the entire room held its breath. Even Ethan Grant, a man who thought he owned the night, couldn't find another word. Because her words didn't just challenge him, they revealed something no one expected. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and stay with us to witness what dignity sounds like when it finally speaks back. The restaurant was the kind of place where silence cost money, where the lighting was low and golden, where every glass shimmered with prestige, and every violin note whispered exclusivity. Nestled in the heart of Manhattan, this wasn't just a place to dine. It was a place to be seen, to remind others that you belonged to a higher rung. Ethan Grant entered like he owned more than just the room. At 38, the tech billionaire was a man sculpted by power. His dark, tailored suit hugged a frame stiff with command, his movements crisp, calculated, and impatient. He didn't speak to the maître d', he nodded. He didn't thank the hostess. He barely noticed her. Two suited guests flanked him as he took his seat at the center table, where the world, as he knew it, revolved around his expectations. The wine was not chilled enough. The lighting over his table slightly too dim. Every small imperfection chipped at his carefully manufactured mood. Claire Monroe approached quietly, her presence as subtle as breath. She was 24, her white blouse starched, and sleeves rolled just high enough to reveal wrists worn by labor. She walked with the kind of grace that didn't draw attention, but deserved it. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her steps measured and smooth. Claire had served tables here for 2 years, ever since her mother's health began to deteriorate and medical bills replaced dreams. She worked double shifts, saved every tip, and said little. To people like Ethan, she was a utility, background noise, a soft, steady rhythm in a world obsessed with volume. She set the napkin gently at his place, but it was the wrong shade of red, a detail meaningless to most. But to Ethan, it was unacceptable. He didn't see the steady hands that served with dignity. He didn't see the exhaustion just barely tucked beneath her flawless uniform. What he saw was error, disrespect. Their contrast said it all. His black suit spoke of dominance and entitlement, her white blouse of quiet endurance. He commanded space. She moved within it. But though Ethan believed he was the one being served, it was Claire who held something far more powerful than the plate in her hand. She held the truth. He just hadn't seen it yet. Claire placed the napkin beside Ethan's plate. Its hue a deep burgundy rather than the standard crimson the restaurant reserved for VIPs. It was a minor error, barely a shade off, but to a man like Ethan Grant, it might as well have been an insult carved in stone. He paused mid-sentence, glanced down, and then looked up at her with a slow, simmering fury. The table went quiet. His guests exchanged brief, amused looks, sensing a storm about to unfold. "Is this a joke?" Ethan snapped, his voice rising like a thunderclap in the hushed ambiance. Claire froze, not in fear, but in poise. She didn't retreat, didn't defend. She simply stood there, hands lightly folded at her waist, her posture unmoved. Ethan pushed back his chair, the legs scraping sharply against the marble floor. Conversations around the room faltered. Forks hovered midair, and all eyes slowly turned toward their table. "Do you even know who I am?" he growled, venom laced through every syllable. "This dinner is worth more than your yearly salary. Maybe two." His guests smirked behind folded napkins, feeding off his arrogance like vultures circling a performance. Still, Claire did not speak. Her chin dipped slightly, eyes cast downward but not broken. Her silence wasn't submission. It was steel wrapped in linen. The quiet in the room thickened, as if the chandeliers themselves were holding their breath. Ethan leaned forward, close enough that she could smell the bitter scent of his $800 wine on his breath. "Say something," he hissed. "Apologize." Each word was a command, meant to remind her of her place. Claire's fingers tightened around her order pad. Slowly, she lifted her gaze. Her expression didn't change. No tremble in her lip, no panic in her breath. Just the soft, steady stare of someone who had carried heavier burdens in silence. The power in the room shifted, if only slightly. "You want me to say something?" she whispered, her voice so soft that only the nearest tables could hear. But in that hush, it traveled like thunder. Ethan straightened, thrown by her tone. His smile faltered. She took a breath. And as her lips parted to speak, no one in that restaurant could have imagined the sentence that would follow, or the history it would unravel. Claire held his gaze with the kind of calm that unnerved men like Ethan Grant. Then she said, with devastating softness, "I know who you are, but do you know who paid for your first line of code?" The sentence sliced through the tension like a wire snapping under strain. Ethan blinked, caught off guard, the arrogance on his face faltering for the first time that evening. A murmur passed through the room, the kind that doesn't come from confusion, but from curiosity sharpened by truth. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. "My grandmother," Claire continued, her voice unwavering, "Eleanor Monroe." She let the name hang in the air, heavy with memory. "You were 20, desperate. Every bank said no. Every investor walked away. But she believed in you. She sent a check, $10,000, from the money she saved waiting tables." Ethan's face began to crumble. The color drained from his skin as she reached into the front pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She carefully unfolded it and laid it on the table beside his untouched plate. The check stub was faded, the ink softened by time, but the numbers and the name were still legible. Eleanor Monroe, $10,000, memo tech idea, believed in him. Gasps rippled through the restaurant. Forks were set down. Wine glasses were lowered. The guests at Ethan's table stared at the slip of paper as if it were radioactive. Claire straightened her spine, her white blouse glowing under the chandelier's golden light. "Your company," she said, "was built on money from a waitress's tip jar." The sentence landed like thunder in a cathedral. Ethan's jaw tensed, but there was no anger now, only disbelief, only shame. His empire of glass and gold, began to fracture in front of everyone. Claire didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. She turned without flourish and walked away, not in defiance, not in rage, but in quiet grace. Every eye in the restaurant followed her, not because she had humiliated him, but because she had reminded them all what power looked like when wrapped in dignity. Ethan remained seated, a man once invincible, now left with his image shattered, surrounded by witnesses who would remember that night not for the wine, the music, or the meal, but for the moment when a waitress made a billionaire realize he'd been living on borrowed kindness all along. After the room had settled and the murmurs faded into an uneasy quiet, Ethan stood, slowly, as though the weight of that single check had aged him 10 years. He found Claire near the kitchen doors, preparing to slip back into her rhythm of service like nothing had happened. But he couldn't let it go. Not now. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice stripped of its earlier authority, now rough with something far more human. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and after a beat of silence, she nodded once. They stepped into a narrow hallway behind the dining floor, lit only by a flickering wall sconce and the echo of cutlery being polished beyond the swinging doors. Ethan stared down at the check stub he still held in his hand, the faded ink feeling more permanent than any of the wealth he'd earned. "It's real," he whispered, more to himself than to her. A flash of memory bloomed behind his eyes. Him, 20 years old, broke and desperate, opening a letter from someone named Eleanor Monroe, a stranger with no reason to believe in him other than a shared dream scribbled in one of his earliest online posts. She hadn't just sent him money, she'd sent him hope, and she died before he could ever thank her. "She told me," Claire said quietly, folding her arms across her chest, "that someday you'd forget where you came from. But the world wouldn't." Her words landed heavier than the ones before. This wasn't revenge, it was revelation. Ethan shook his head slowly. "All these years, and you were right there, watching, serving." He winced. "Why didn't you ever say something before?" Claire's expression softened, but not with pity. "Because I was raised to serve with dignity, to carry strength in silence. But tonight," she took a breath, her tone calm, deliberate. "Tonight, you needed to be reminded of it." The twist wasn't just that the check was real. It wasn't just that his entire company owed its start to a waitress with a kind heart. The real twist was that while he soared in headlines and held press conferences on stages around the world, Claire had been walking past his face on magazine covers, carrying plates, scrubbing counters, paying for her mother's treatment in installments. She hadn't chased attention. She hadn't asked for favors. She'd simply waited for a moment when her voice would matter most. And that moment, as Ethan now knew, had come like a lightning bolt across linen and pride. The headlines came 3 days later. Tech giant credits. Success to waitress's family investment. But for once, Ethan Grant wasn't the one feeding the story. He stood at the press conference, his tailored suit crisp, but his voice humble, quieter than anyone had ever heard it. Cameras flashed, microphones extended like eager hands, but Ethan wasn't there to perform. He spoke her name, Eleanor Monroe, with reverence, not as a marketing ploy, but as a vow. He told the world about a woman who had sent him a $10,000 check when no one else would return his calls, and how, without her, his company, his empire, his name, none of it would have existed. Then came the announcement. A $10 million donation to a scholarship fund in Eleanor's name, requested specifically by her granddaughter, Claire. But Claire didn't take a single dollar for herself. Instead, she used the gesture to do something Ethan never expected. She founded a hospitality training center on the south end of the city, a place where women from shelters, single mothers, and underprivileged girls could learn not just how to serve food, but how to stand tall while doing it. The building wasn't grand, but it was warm, painted soft cream, with wide windows and a welcoming red door. And on the day of its opening, a brass plaque was mounted by the entrance. It read simply, "Where service meets strength, the Eleanor Monroe Center." Ethan came to the ribbon cutting, but stayed in the back. No entourage, no cameras. He didn't want a seat on the stage. He just wanted to witness it. Claire stood at the podium, her voice steady, her presence radiant in a way that had nothing to do with spotlight and everything to do with self-respect. She didn't mention Ethan's name. She didn't have to. The story was already written in the eyes of every woman in that audience who saw what dignity looked like when it was no longer quiet. At the end of the ceremony, Claire walked down from the stage, her steps slow and sure. She caught sight of him standing near the door, half in shadow. She paused. Their eyes met. She didn't smile, didn't wave. Instead, she nodded. Once. A gesture not of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement. She saw him now not as a tyrant, nor as a symbol, but as a man who had finally remembered what it meant to owe someone. And Ethan nodded back, his chest tight, his pride replaced by something quieter, accountability. His transformation wasn't loud. It wasn't wrapped in redemption arcs or applause. But it had begun. And all it had taken was one sentence, spoken softly, with truth, in a room where power thought it had the final word. Claire stood in front of the classroom inside the hospitality center, her voice calm as she guided a young woman through the art of balancing a tray, not just with poise, but with pride. Sunlight filtered through the windows, catching the gold plaque on the wall like a quiet promise. The students listened not just to her instructions, but to her presence. She wasn't just teaching service. She was teaching self-worth. As one girl wobbled slightly under the weight of her first full tray, Claire steadied her with a gentle touch and a smile that said more than words ever could. Later that evening, as the center emptied and the rooms fell quiet, Claire sat beside the plaque bearing her grandmother's name and whispered, "It wasn't revenge. It was remembrance. For her. For me." Because the truth she'd spoken that night wasn't meant to wound. It was meant to restore. And it had. Now ask yourself, have you ever stood silent for too long until one sentence changed everything? If this story spoke to something deep in you, share it with someone who needs to reclaim their voice. And follow us for more stories where dignity doesn't whisper. It roars. Thank you for watching. Until next time, where truth finds its timing.